I forget this time, but I didn't pull it up. Icebreaker question. So what's us?
That's right.
Apparently, you do this more than a couple times, and it's now tradition that um, this is how we open these things
Look
as
at
we
what you've
wait
done.
for.
Look at what you've done.
It's what happens. The only list of icebreaker questions you'll ever need. That's the only one I've ever looked at.
How many are there on that list?
I think it's 100. It's probably 10 different categories of. Nah, that's not true, because there's 25. So how many questions are there? It doesn't say. Um, okay, these are kind of dumb, but how many cups of coffee, tea, or beverage of choice do you have each morning?
Two.
Probably don't. I was gonna say I probably don't measure by cup as by like vessel that it's served in.
Yeah. So it's probably four if it's by cup, right? If cup is a 6 ounce cup,
Yeah,
it's four.
yeah, because I literally just made a pour over. So this is one vessel, but then I slowly pour it into this cup. So how many cups that is, I have no idea. But this is my afternoon vessel. So the morning vessel is a Chemex. Afternoon vessel is a pour over, or potentially an AeroPress, depending on the day. But
Fair.
so yeah,
Yeah,
that's
it's probably 4 cups, but it's 2 mugs worth, and
yeah.
always the big mug.
See, I'm not a big mug person. I don't know if this is gonna tell us anything about our personality types, but I am I pour a little bit at a time, and I only pour it like halfway. I don't know if you can
Oh yeah,
see, like I
that's
only
really
pour it about halfway through, and I slowly sip on it, and then I just like maybe I think in part it's the act of pouring and like doing everything that is more important to me than the actual process of drinking it.
that's fair.
It's the ritual itself. Um, which is what I've always said until I try to quit, and then I can't quit because I get caffeine headaches. So I
I
say
think.
it's a ritual, and then it turns out not being.
I mean, I pour it and then I let it sit for like 5 to 10 minutes because I want it to be not hot. Like I don't want it to be lukewarm, but it's got to be warm hot as opposed to hot or
Mm-hmm.
scalding, right? Like Starbucks is scalding. Like it burns you, and you have to sit with it in your hands for like an hour before you can even drink it. But like warm hot, so like
Starbucks,
5 to 10 minutes.
yeah. In a lot of those places, like you get a scalding hot cup of coffee, and then it cools off, and then you have about 3 minutes to drink the whole thing, and then it's like cold. Where I find the
Yeah,
way I've tended to make it, I actually enjoy the process of like it being drink. It needs to be drinkable the second I finish pouring it, or like finish
that'd
making
be
it.
great.
And then the process from that, I actually enjoy drinking it through like the hot to the lukewarm into the cold, because this is like the nerdy coffee person in me, but like each stage has a different flavor profile, and so you can get
Yeah,
different flavors from each different stage that you do or that you drink. Um, so yeah,
my camera died on me again.
I was gonna say I lost your video there, but
Yeah, guess it is what it is. Maybe it'll come back. I have an idea. I love it'll work. I got nothing. What are you gonna do?
cool. Yeah, well, we can get started. Oh, there we go.
Boom.
Look at that. Look at
Wait around.
that. Yeah. So what? Today. So last week, today, and then next week, are all centered around this idea. These live streams on Tuesdays are all centered around the idea of winter is coming, and how to prepare as best as we can for the darkness that is about to fall. We even noticed it yesterday when we were driving back from the saga that is buying jeans. That's another story for another day. Um, but we were driving back and realized like how dark it got at like 7:30, and I think it was like black by 8 o'clock or something like that. So it's getting dark sooner, faster, and so it's coming.
It's coming quick.
And so last week we kind of talked about kind of different coping mechanisms or way that you and I have like found on how we rest, as well as like how we kind of got to that place of understanding, or like what our journey is. Like I can't necessarily say if we've arrived at this is how we rest, but like how our process works of how we understand how we rest and how we kind of move forward from there, or learn more about ourselves using the Enneagram specifically.
Yeah.
Today, I think I want to talk a little bit about the importance of community in this. Like, so right now on Sundays, we're talking through the Book of Acts, and we're kind of in a 3-part homily mini series about from isolation to community. And I think that's very fitting with kind of where we're at right now with winter is coming and kind of preparing for all that. So yeah, I kind of want to talk through the importance of community, a little bit about the conversation that I've been having with many people around the idea of the nuclear family. I know that's a conversation that is kind of, I don't know if it's on the forefront of a lot of people's minds, but at least it's on the forefront of my mind often. And I know back in like June, it got kind of big and then it's kind of died off a little bit, but it's still, we were just having a conversation right before this about nuclear family and community and all this stuff. So I figured we would kind of continue the conversation through that. So yeah, where we can go from here. I guess I'll give a snapshot of kind of like where I've been at with like the process of nuclear family, and then we can kind of talk about what we were just talking about before this is going from there. So I think for me, the idea of, well, I got to text my wife that Forrest is waking up. The idea of nuclear family is a fairly new, it's not a new concept, but it's a new idea for me, or even a new term for me. It's not necessarily one that I've been aware of or used to speaking about. It was just kind of like I have never really, and this is the word that gets me in trouble, I've never really deconstructed what family is. I've deconstructed many a thing in my life, but family has yet to be one of them. And so here we are deconstructing family. Maybe that's because it's on the heels of like having a child, and like getting married is a little different. Like having a child is a completely different situation when it comes to like family unit and like freedoms and all that jazz. But
I think a good thing to do is like to actually define what deconstruct means. And the whole idea of deconstructing something is not destruction. The whole idea is like getting to the core of what it actually is. Like what are all the other things that we've locked on top of it to kind of muddy the waters a little bit? Like as we peel away some of the chaff, right? Like what are we left with at the very center? Like that's the idea of deconstruction. Not to destroy, but to find the core of the idea.
Yeah, it's to find the core. It's to find like the origins of it, and that helps you define the core. It's asking a lot of questions primarily. It's not necessarily like you don't walk in, or at least this is how I've done it. Like you don't walk in. No one really likes doing deconstruction, like because I think it's exhausting. It is disruptive of your like. You can't just float through life if you're like deconstructing everything all the time. Like it's not an enjoyable, no one wants to do it in perpetuity for the rest of their life. However, I think it is an important tool that we can use to learn about how we go about our lives. Like if we went completely unchecked and we never deconstructed anything, like I think in part, that's where I know we've talked about, what's the word? Not complacency, but passivity in the church around racism. There's a word I'm trying to think of. Complicity, yeah. Compliance, yeah. Around racism in the church. And that's in part because power went unchecked. Ideas went unchecked. Why we do what we do went unchecked. And we arrive at where we're at now around race issues, even race issues within the church. So I think it's dangerous to not go through life ever having deconstructed anything.
Right.
But yeah, the goal of deconstructing is not just to destroy your ideals or your values or whatever. It's to examine closely so that you can understand the origins and the purpose of it, so that you can move forward in a better and brighter light. And you might find, if something is true and perfect, that after you've done deconstructing, you're like, well, it was the best it ever could be, and you just kind of rebuild what it is that you already had.
And that's key. Like there's a reconstruction element as well.
Yeah.
Like once you get down to the core, it's like, oh, we have shed some of the cultural ideals, some of the outdated theological ideas and ideals. Like once we've shed all of that and we've got this core, now we have to rebuild upon that, because otherwise it doesn't work. It doesn't move anywhere. It doesn't take us anywhere. It's got to be, you can't just live with the core. You have to actually begin to construct something on top of it again. So that in generations down the road, they will again deconstruct and reconstruct. It's a cultural, societal move that is continually happening.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. It's both. It can happen internally and individually at an individual level, as well as like externally and at a communal level.
Yeah.
Of deconstruction. And yeah, that reconstruction bit is extremely important. Otherwise, if you only ever deconstruct, you're left with nihilism.
Yep.
And like there's nothing left. And you have to begin to rebuild whatever it is you were taking apart.
Probably one of the best, like if you want to take it to a scriptural standpoint, one of the best deconstructionist books is Ecclesiastes. Mm-hmm. Like he starts with this idea of like everything is meaningless, like everything is awful and garbage, and like now I'm going to start deconstructing all of these things as I search for the meaning of life. Like he was deconstructing life. Like Solomon was deconstructing life, tearing it all down.
Purpose
like,
of life.
Yeah. Like work is pointless. Like happiness is pointless. Partying is pointless. Like all of these things, like it's just pointless. Until he gets down to the core, which is Ecclesiastes 12. Like he actually gets to that point. The meaning of life is to fear the Lord and obey his commands. Like that's it. Like he gets down to the red hot core of everything. Like all of these other things that had been built upon that idea, he tears them all away and says, no, this is what it is. This is the point. This is the meaning. And then he builds from there after that. Not in the book, but in his life.
Yeah, you begin to build on those ideals and those values, those true values. Yeah. And so, yeah, that's kind of the deconstruction process. And so I think for me, I've been in the process of deconstructing the nuclear family as a term that is fairly new to me. I know it's been around for whatever, but the idea or the term or that understanding is a fairly new idea for me. And then also learning how to define the term nuclear family is also important. Specifically when it comes to around the Black Lives Matter values or mission statement or whatever it is that they're calling it. They use the word that is I think is super helpful, that of the Western prescribed nuclear family, which helps us to understand that what they're talking about is what the Atlantic calls it is the failed experiment of the 50s and 60s. This idea of nuclear family being like the epitome of individualism and freedom. And many families, to my brief understanding of what happened, many families in the 50s and 60s began to move into the cities for jobs and opportunity. So they moved away from the rural extended family support network and moved into the city for opportunity, and that placed the value on the mother, the father, and the children. And then around that is when the idea of the American dream kind of came about, of 2.5 kids, white picket fence, mom, dad, and a dog playing in the yard. That's where that idea came from. And what happened there is that is viewed as this like utopia kind of thing that many people want to go back to. we want to go back to that dream of this perfect utopia of these isolated nuclear families. I think using the word isolated is also an important term when talking about what we're talking about, because that's what they were. They were isolated individual units that pursued freedom at their own luxury.
Right.
And so what we're experiencing now is that system could not support the stress of an everyday family. So job loss, or just economic struggle, or a divorce, or the death of a child, or any number of things. Like, the family unit cannot survive on its own without some kind of support network. Right. And so what I've begun to ask in my own like deconstruction is like, why, or what are we talking about when we talk about nuclear family, specifically within the church? Like, my deconstruction is probably within the church structure, maybe not like within societal structure. That's a bigger conversation when we talk about like how that has affected Black and brown people in their lives and how they live, or that how nuclear family is understood outside of the evangelical Christian church. I mean, that's a better way to put it. So I'm kind of working within this singular bubble, because that's kind of the bubble that I live and grew up in. Mm-hmm. But I understand and recognize that like there are probably different terms and different understandings of what nuclear family and extended family look like. But for me, that's kind of the bubble that I'm operating in or trying to understand. So yeah, I think in all of this conversation, the big thing that I always come to, and we were talking about, Aaron, is like the idea of an isolated nuclear family is all about, or values highly, individualism and values highly privacy.
Yep.
And intimacy only within the family unit itself.
That's the only place that intimacy resides, is in the family. You can have a faux mm-hmm. intimacy outside of that. You let some people in, but they only get to come in so far, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, like true intimacy happens within the family unit, right? Yeah. And I wonder if, in part, like the reason that may be, and this is why deconstruction I think is so critical, because you begin to understand like how interwoven everything is. Like, when you talk, which is also the danger and exhaustion of deconstruction, is you begin to understand like, well, I take this down, now I got to take this down. Because you begin to realizing as like true intimacy happens within like, you know, within the family unit and within the couple or the partners, you can kind of begin to see why the church has always strived for community and intimacy, but it always hits a wall. It feels like there's always this wall that gets hit. And so we're always asking like, why? And maybe this might be part of it, is the cultural understanding of like where intimacy takes place.
Yes, absolutely. I think that's what's fascinating is when you think about it in terms of like the church, mm-hmm. there's a sense of we want to have intimacy with people, but we don't really know what that means or what that looks like. It's become a buzzword in many respects. Like, I want intimacy with people. I want to live in community with people. I want my people kind of thing. But that doesn't actually exist in the church to a large extent. And it's because we still live underneath that ideal of the nuclear family. And so, and like as you described, like the 50 story, like that's our story. Yeah. Like that's Tracy and my story. Like we moved to the city, right? We moved away from family. It's just her and me and Elliot, and that's it. And so it's like this nuclear family here. But for us, our goal and our attempt and our desire is to actually create a bigger family. In some respects, that's why we planted a church, right? It was like that idea of like, no, we can have this, like this greater sense of intimacy, this greater openness with one another in this space. And I think, you know what? I think what may be some of the challenge is defining the word intimacy. Like, one, we don't know what it is, but then two, like I think we also have like when we talk about intimacy in a family, like especially when you talk about like partners, it's usually sexual, right? It's usually like, oh, that's intimacy. So, well, we can't really do that outside of that confine everywhere else, because then you've got some sort of crazy polygamous commune running around, right? Like that's the like that. Darn it! I was hoping for a spit take right there, and it didn't work. You drank too slow.
I'm a sipper. I just take the time.
But I think that's a thing, is like we don't necessarily understand what intimacy is, and as we look toward, like, as we as a church continue to work to build community, especially as we prepare for winter, right? Like community in the winter and what that looks like, with all of these thoughts and ideals that are swirling around. What does that mean? What does that look like? How do we experience these sorts of things? We know what we want, but we don't know what it looks like. Mm-hmm. But we'll know it when we see it, maybe, right? Like that kind of idea.
Yeah, this idea of like, and I think there's so many different levels to what it means to be intimate. Like we've been using, Tulissa and I, when we talk about like what parts of our lives are difficult and like what we need to address, is we broke it apart. I use 5. I think someone else has used 6. So I don't know. Doesn't really matter. But it was like emotional health, physical health, financial health, relational health, and mental health. I think were the 5. There might be a 6th one that I can't
Spiritual
for some reason. What was that?
Spiritual health.
Spiritual health. You know, the one that we're kind of talking about here. And I think that might be a great way to kind of understand like those 6 things. How can we as a community be intimate in those 6 things, or intimate or vulnerable with one another in those 6 things? And I think there are probably lines that certain people won't want to cross, or are maybe challenging. The one specifically I think of is like financial intimacy. Like there was one conversation I had with someone around like the idea of nuclear family and like the communal compound thing. Like there are people that talk about that. Like I have friends who actually tried it. They bought a house with another couple and tried to live together. I have another friend who is considering a very similar thing, like buying a plot of land with another couple, because it's the only way they could afford that amount of land in the city or around the city. And I think there has to be an understanding or a acceptance of what level of financial intimacy you're willing to go into. And I think like that's just one category where you could talk, okay, how much do we want to reveal about our situation, our financial situation? How much do we want to get intertangled between the 2 of us, or the 3 of us, or the community of us? I mean, to some degree, that's kind of what the church does. Like we give to this community, and then we use those resources to hire staff, to pay for buildings. Like in some way, we kind of already do that from like a financial perspective. In many situations, like churches buy buildings and they buy land and like that. So it's not necessarily a foreign concept, but I think the idea of like integrating all of those pieces is where things get really challenging.
Yeah. Yeah, I agree. I think it's transparency on a level that is countercultural at this point, right? Because at this point, everything has been ingrained towards that idea of the nuclear family: mom, dad, kids, dog. That's it, right? Like that's where intimacy. And what's fascinating about that is, even when that happened, there was still, and even today, like there's still stuff you hide from your kids, right? Like they don't find out about things, like the marriage is on the rocks, and the kids didn't find out about it until like, hey, guess what? We're separating. And it's like, what? Right? Like there's even things like in terms of intimacy that isn't even there fully in the nuclear family, where there's not that complete transparency. So even those sorts of ideas, that the ideal of the nuclear family isn't even fully lived into. Like it's not fully present. And I think that in and of itself is also a really fascinating tale to tell of like, well, this experiment and this idea doesn't really work fully. Like there's got to be more to it. And I think that's what was being done in the book of Acts, was like a reconstitution of the family. Where it's like, look, like we are all in this sucker together. We're in this life together. We share our resources. We share our lives fully. Like, I think it's in Acts 2. They were one in spirit and in mind. Like there was no division among them. Like everything about who they were were one in thought and mind, or something like that. Like that is a unity. That is an intimacy that is present. That we don't see today.
Well, and that's the thing, like in Acts 2, like that it's so fascinating how the church for so long is a relative term, the church for the last, I don't know, 2 decades, maybe 3 decades, have like wanted to back to the Acts 2 church. We need to go back to this kind of thing. But then when we actually look at Acts chapter 2 and like the early parts of Acts and like the way that they lived, like it is so countercultural, even countercultural within the culture of the church. Like I think it goes against like the way that we have typically structured our churches. Acts chapter 2 goes against all of that.
Yeah.
And there was another thought that I had earlier of when you had mentioned that like within the family unit, intimacy like has varying degrees of intimacy. I think there is a shift that is happening, I think, within the relationships of parents to their children that is far different than the relationship of parents to their children from like generations in the past, where like I know for us, like we're practicing like bringing Forrest into different activities that we do as a family, or apologizing to him when we like mess up and we, get angry or something like that. Like there's this movement of trying to strengthen that intimacy there. And I think in part that's a desire as well, that is like, that's a core desire that is wanted elsewhere too, of intimacy within community, and what does that look like and how do we get there?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Even like oftentimes Elliot will ask why. I'll tell her to go do something. She'll be like, why? And the lazy response that I give is because I said so. Right? Just go do it because I said so. I just need you to go do this thing. But the non-lazy response is to actually engage in that conversation. Why? Well, this is why I need you to do this, is X, Y, and Z. And, oh, okay, fine. And she'll go do it. Sometimes she'll be like, oh, and she'll go do it, right? Like the minor protest of, oh. And, but like those sorts of things are even different, right? Like I got all the time, like, oh, because I said so, because I said so, because I said so.
Yeah.
Okay, fine.
Well, I think that's a great example of like, there's a desire for intimacy and community, but it requires something of you. So like it's way easier to just say like, because I said so, or to like shrug it off or whatever. It's so much easier to do that than to like sit and explain everything all the time, right? Like that would be exhausting to have to, like, we're not quite, Forrest isn't talking yet, but we will get to that why stage pretty soon. And I imagine it is quite exhausting to like play 20 questions of why. Yes. And so I think there's a parallel to like the desire for community and the cost that is required for what we desire.
Right.
Like it is costly to like be in a partner relationship where you expose and you bring your full self to the table. That same thing at a communal level is also exhausting and can be costly, because similar how like a deconstruction lifestyle can be exhausting because you're constantly having to think and ruminate and living in vulnerability all the time is also costs you and can be exhausting. But that's where the cost benefit, now we're getting into like like business
Cost benefit
terms.
analysis.
Yeah. The benefit, in my opinion, outweighs the cost that it brings you, because you're creating. And I heard a term, from some group that we, or some coaching thing we went through, the term extended spiritual family,
Yeah.
because in the conversation around nuclear family, you usually hear like chosen family.
Hmm.
Seems to be a term that, like, if you leave your family for whatever reason, and by leave I mean like physically distance yourself, or maybe even like completely remove yourself, from your family, you still have to find your chosen family, which I think is what we've tried to do by starting churches,
Yeah.
is trying to create it. Like, I still remember when we started, when we were first starting having conversations of like, who do we want to, come to United, like who is our target audience, right? It was always people who have left their families and moved into Seattle and have no one.
Yeah.
Like, we were looking for those exiles. That's because we wanted to start a community of a chosen extended spiritual family where we can create that network for each other and create that support for one
That's
another.
really good.
And so I think, like, I'm starting to put language to like why we chose to do what we did and why we look the way we look, um, and how can we continue to go forward, to use this language and have community.
Yeah.
Because you can't do it alone. Like, that goes down to like, you'll never walk alone. Like, that's also the reason we have that, is because we want to create a space, where we can do this together. We can make it through the winter together. We can make it through the darkness together. But it comes at a cost.
Mhm.
It's not going to be easy. It's going to cost vulnerability and openness, which is no small price to pay, but a small price to pay for, longevity and sanity.
And I think that's good. Like looking towards the winter as that is becoming readily apparent, and even more so, and as we're still stuck in this. Are we still in a quarantine? Like, I don't know what to call this
No
anymore.
idea.
Like, what this space is, which in some respects is chosen too, right? Like, it's level of comfortability that is present, as well as some of it's mandated, right? So there's those sorts of questions. But as we step into the winter and things aren't changing, I mean, they're getting a little bit better in terms of our numbers at the moment. Our state is kind of orangish yellow instead of the dark orange, so that's good. Like, we're getting
Progress.
better, on the map, right? And even King County, like, our numbers are starting to recede a little bit more. We're nowhere near where we were, and we're nowhere near where we should be, right? Like, we're a long way off, and we're a long way from. All of that to say, like, we've got to figure some of this intimacy stuff out as a church, as a people, moving forward into the winter, because the isolation is going to get really, really, really bad and really rough. The CDC just the other, just not too long ago, put out that over 40% of people within the United States have admitted, this is an admission, to some sort of mental deterioration, or a deterioration in their mental health. Over 40%. And for Seattle, like, when we get into the dark, like, if it's 40% now, it's going to be 80%, right? Like 75,
Yeah.
80% when we get into the darkness. And so I think we've got some time. So that's why we're doing this now, right? Is we've got some time between now and the full-on darkness of October, like of late October, early November, when it really starts to happen quicker and quicker and quicker. We've got some time over the course of these next few weeks, and especially this week as it's gorgeous outside, to get outside, to be with some people in those spaces, in that small microcosm of being and actually doing something with one another. I think that's got to be key.
Yeah, and I think, there's two parts to like living into that community moving forward, and in preparation is one, being willing to admit or say where you're at.
Yeah.
And then part two is there are, I would assume, if 40%, I mean, that's, a pretty large number. If there is there needs to be a willingness to step out and reach out to people that that are in the community that you haven't heard from in a while, or maybe going through something. So I think there's two parts, right? There's the willingness to receive, and there's the willingness to reach out.
Yeah.
And I think
that's good.
And we typically place that on the shoulders of the pastors. At least that's how like it has worked in churches I've been in. But that is also not a sustainable model, which is why right now I think I read that 1 in 5 pastors are quitting during the pandemic or something along those lines.
It's really high, and it's only going to
it's only going to get higher once winter hits and the longer this goes on. So like this is not to say like don't expect something from us, but it's more to say we need to be able to do this together.
Yeah.
Right? Like we play our role, and that's guiding us all forward. But we all need to be playing this role together of reaching out for one another or to one another, as well as the willingness to then admit or be open and vulnerable and everything.
And that's also to say, like, I'll speak for you, Trevor, like, we need you, right? Like, we need the community, right? Like,
exactly.
I had somebody this past weekend, I didn't know how to answer the question, ask me, like, how can we support you? And I was like, oh, you know what? I can't remember the last time I've heard that from someone within the church, right? Like, not because it's not thought about, but not actually posed. I think, no, I'm not going to say that. It's just, it's so good. Like, to hear that question and be like, I don't know how to respond to that. Like, and that even forces me to get more in touch with myself, right? Exactly. Self-awareness of like, wow, what do I need? Like, what do I need from people within our own community? Like, how do we actually formulate that intimacy, that circle of intimacy among us all?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that teaches us or forces self-awareness, as well as forces us, so you and me, to practice what we're saying in like being vulnerable in admission and such. Because so I grew up as a pastor's kid, so I've been in a pastor's family my entire life. And there is this, I don't want to say complex, but understanding or unwritten understanding that I grew up with and like brought into the first few years of my ministry is that you can never show signs of weakness, or that you have to be strong. You have to be the example of how to live a perfect life, or so on and so forth. So there's like a perfectionism kind of thing involved. And so in part, it's us learning to unlearn that mindset. At least for me, like that, that's kind of what I've lived in that kind of bubble for so long. And so, it's a two-way street, right? It's like, we're having this conversation both to shine a light on it, as well as to kind of push us forward. And we're having this conversation not because we have it figured out, either the two of us or as a community. It's not saying like we know how to do community. It's more like we actually don't. And so that's why we're talking about it. Yeah. And that's why we're trying to deconstruct what is family, what is community, what is the church. Like, there's so many things that we can like be working to examine and find the goodness out of, so that we can build something better for the future. And I think a lot of us are in that space of like, how do we make a better future for our kids when it comes to climate change and race tensions and issues. So I think we're all in that kind of state. And I think it's an important thing not to bypass and try to get out of quickly, but to actually sit in it and hold the tension, so that we can build a better, build a better tomorrow. Didn't like it. It came through my head, but it's what it is.
I just had like a like a Farm Aid moment, like right, like
Yeah.
like one of those.
Yeah. But yeah, that's kind of the idea. So
Yeah, that's good. Cool.
cool. Well, thank you everyone for listening along, watching along. I don't know if we came up with anything practical there, but I think a lot of starter conversation stuff. I think that we can kind of continue to have with one another. We'll kind of continue in different spaces of United, whether that be like online Sunday services or the Sunday circle that we have coming up every Sunday. But yeah, thank you
And
guys
next
for
week we've
watching.
got Heather.
Yes, and next week we have Heather Barnes who will be joining us. She is a licensed therapist up in, she's moving, but she was up in the Marysville area. And so she is my former boss at the Seattle school, and also an Enneagram 5. So she will be with us next week to kind of talk through some different things from the perspective of a therapist and psychology and so on and so forth. So it should be great. So yeah, we will see you all next week.